In the rural hills of western Pennsylvania, there exists a collection of church relics that no historian can properly trace. Across 17 different congregations stretching from Philadelphia to the frontier settlements, small bone fragments and preserved flesh sit within ornate reliquaries, their origins obscured by time and deliberate deception. Between 1745 and 1792, more than 73 individuals vanished from these communities. Devout men, women, and most disturbingly, orphaned children, later declared saints by local religious leaders. What few know is that a sealed record in the Philadelphia Historical Society contains the testimonies of 3 witnesses who uncovered the truth. The Whitmore family workshop, where human bodies were processed into holy relics for nearly 5 decades. The manuscript has remained sealed for centuries at the request of the churches involved. But through careful research, I have uncovered the horrifying truth that the religious establishment has desperately tried to keep hidden. Before we continue with the story of the Whitmore family's gruesome enterprise, hit the subscribe button if you're brave enough to hear historical horrors that few channels dare to reveal. Let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Perhaps your local church holds secrets you never imagined. Now, let's delve deeper into this disturbing chapter of American religious history. The true horror of what happened in those Pennsylvania woods extends far beyond what most historians are willing to acknowledge, touching communities whose descendants still worship in those same churches today. The colony of Pennsylvania in the mid-18th century existed as a unique religious haven. While the Quakers dominated Philadelphia and its surrounding counties with their plain meeting houses and emphasis on inner light, the Western territories saw a blend of Protestant denominations, Presbyterian, Lutheran, and smaller Christian sects, each establishing modest wooden churches as they pushed further into frontier lands claimed from native peoples. The Whitmore family arrived from England in 1742, settling in Chester County approximately 30 miles west of Philadelphia, where rolling hills gave way to dense forests and scattered farmsteads. Nathaniel Whitmore, a stern-faced man with penetrating gray eyes and a trimmed beard that framed his angular jawline, presented himself as a skilled craftsman of religious items, chalices, communion plates, and ornate Bible covers that quickly gained favor among the wealthier congregations. His workshop, a 2-story timber structure situated on 12 acres of wooded land, featured large windows that flooded the main floor with natural light. There, he would receive ministers and church elders who commissioned his increasingly sought-after work. His wife, Elizabeth, a slender woman with delicate hands and an unnerving ability to maintain a placid expression regardless of circumstances, managed their household and 4 children with precision that neighbors found admirable, if somewhat cold. The Whitmores attended Sunday services at Harmony Meeting House, a modest Quaker gathering, where they sat quietly during worship, occasionally offering measured testimonies that impressed the congregation with their apparent spiritual depth. Their eldest son, Thomas, assisted his father in the workshop, while daughters Mary and Sarah helped their mother with household duties. The youngest, William, a frail boy with an unsettling intensity in his gaze, often spent hours alone in the woods, returning with plants and small animal specimens that he meticulously preserved in his room, a hobby his parents encouraged as a scientific pursuit. Chester County in those years faced the typical challenges of colonial life: harsh winters, occasional crop failures, and the constant tension of frontier existence. Yet it was also a time of religious fervor and economic growth. The Great Awakening had swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, leaving in its wake a heightened spiritual awareness and competition between denominations for souls and status. Churches sought to distinguish themselves not only through doctrine but through the quality of their buildings and religious artifacts. The Whitmores seemed perfectly positioned to serve this market. Nathaniel's craftsmanship elevated him above local competitors, and by 1745 his workshop had expanded to include 2 apprentices, Jacob Miller, the orphaned son of German immigrants, and Peter Collins, a quiet young man from a poor family in Philadelphia. The family lived comfortably, though not ostentatiously, gaining a reputation for industriousness and piety that served as an effective mask for what occurred behind the workshop's closed doors after sunset. It was in late autumn of 1745 when Mary Collins, a devout Quaker woman known for her healing work among the poor, disappeared while traveling home from visiting a sick family on the outskirts of the county. Her disappearance caused brief concern, but as often happened in colonial times, it was eventually attributed to an Indian attack or wild animal encounter. What no one knew then was that Mary Collins represented the beginning of a horrifying enterprise that would continue undetected for nearly half a century. On November 17, 1745, as an early winter storm descended upon Chester County, Mary Collins made her final journey along the rutted path that led past the Whitmore property. The sky had darkened prematurely, heavy clouds promising snow, as the wind drove brittle leaves across the frozen ground. Mary, a widow of 43 years with gray-streaked hair and hands weathered from decades of charitable work, pulled her woolen cloak tighter, quickening her pace as she passed the lantern light glowing from the Whitmore workshop. According to Thomas Whitmore's confession, written years later from his deathbed and discovered hidden in the wall of a Philadelphia prison cell, his father had been watching Mary Collins for weeks. Father said her reputation for saintliness would make her perfect, Thomas wrote in shaky script. He told us God had revealed to him a great purpose, a way to bring true holiness to the colonies through sacred vessels. As Mary passed the property, Nathaniel emerged from the trees, lantern in hand, calling for assistance. His voice, tinged with practiced desperation, explained that his son William had wandered into the woods and failed to return. Mary, known for her kindness, did not hesitate to offer her help despite the approaching storm. She followed Nathaniel deeper into the property, away from the road, and toward a small clearing where the workshop's rear entrance stood, partially concealed by a stand of pine trees. I watched from the window as Father led her inside. Thomas's confession continued. Mother had prepared the back room with canvas cloths covering the floor. I didn't understand yet what they intended. I was 16 and believed when they spoke of creating sacred relics, they meant crafting representations, not... The handwriting here became illegible, as if the writer's hand had trembled too violently to form coherent letters. What happened in that back room remained mercifully undetailed in Thomas's account, but the aftermath was described with disturbing precision. Mary Collins's body was methodically processed over the following 3 days. Nathaniel, who had studied preservation techniques from medical texts brought from England, taught his eldest son how to treat human tissue with a mixture of salt, herbs, and other substances to prevent decay. Elizabeth Whitmore sewed small pouches of varying sizes from black velvet, each embroidered with golden religious symbols. Father said we were doing God's work, Thomas wrote. He said the Protestant churches of America lacked the sacred relics that gave the Catholic Church its power, and that we would provide what was needed to elevate true worship in the colonies. I believed him then. God forgive me. Believed him. 2 weeks after Mary Collins's disappearance, Nathaniel Whitmore traveled to Philadelphia carrying several ornate wooden boxes of his own crafting. He returned with more commissions than ever before and a considerable sum of money. At the next Quaker meeting, he spoke movingly about the loss of our dear friend Mary and suggested a special memorial service be held. During this service, he presented the meeting house with an exquisitely crafted altar box, explaining that he had made it in Mary's honor. What the congregation did not know was that sealed within a hidden compartment of that box was a small piece of Mary Collins herself, the first of what would become hundreds of sacred relics distributed throughout the colonies over the following decades. The winter of 1745 passed into spring, and with the thaw came rumors from Philadelphia. Whispers of miraculous healings began to circulate, attributed to a holy relic kept by a modest Episcopal church in the city. The rector claimed that a fragment of bone from an unidentified 18th-century saint had cured 3 parishioners of their ailments. He explained that the bone had been obtained from a European dealer through a local craftsman. That craftsman was Nathaniel Whitmore. By 1750, the Whitmore family's business had expanded significantly. Their workshop had doubled in size, employing 5 apprentices who produced the visible works, the ornate boxes, chalices, and religious objects that served as the family's respectable public face. None of these young men were ever allowed into the cellar rooms beneath the workshop, where the true nature of the Whitmore operation took place. The family had also built a new home, a sturdy two-story structure of stone and timber, a monument to their growing prosperity. The disappearance of Mary Collins had faded into memory, replaced by scattered accounts of other missing individuals. A visiting preacher, a devout widow, solitary souls without close family ties. Their absences were easily explained away by the perils of colonial travel, or the convenient specter of frontier raids. What changed during this period was the Whitmore's method of selecting their victims. Elizabeth Whitmore developed what she called the discernment, according to Sarah Whitmore's journal discovered in 1823 during the demolition of the abandoned family home. She claimed she could recognize those whose bodies would produce the most powerful relics, saying that God spoke to her and revealed which souls were destined for sainthood. This chilling belief allowed the family to frame their crimes not as murder, but as divine vocation. They told themselves they were merely helping these chosen individuals fulfill their heavenly purpose earlier than fate intended. Meanwhile, the family refined their method of creating and distributing relics. Nathaniel built connections with church leaders across Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and as far south as Virginia. He carefully cultivated these relationships with generous donations, superb craftsmanship, and the selective sharing of inside information about supposed European relics becoming available through his overseas contacts. Father told them the Catholic Church in Europe had hoarded sacred power for centuries, Thomas Whitmore confessed years later. He convinced these Protestant ministers that obtaining relics quietly and discreetly would bring the same power to their congregations without forcing them to embrace Catholicism. His arguments resonated with ambitious ministers eager to expand their flocks. Over time, the family developed a subtle network of collaborators, mostly unaware of the truth, who relayed reports of miracles connected to relics supplied by the Whitmores. These glowing accounts were shared with prospective buyers, driving up demand and inflating prices. Nathaniel instructed church leaders to keep the existence of the relics a closely guarded secret, known only to elders, a strategy that limited exposure while heightening their perceived sanctity. None of these ministers knew that the ancient relics they had purchased at great cost came not from Europe, but from the bodies of their own neighbors. In the spring of 1753, a physician from Lancaster named Dr. Samuel Winters began asking questions after examining one of these healing relics for a patient who claimed to have been cured. His close inspection revealed that the preserved tissue was far too fresh to be as old as claimed and showed preservation techniques unlike any used in Europe. Before his investigation could proceed, Dr. Winters vanished on the road between Lancaster and Philadelphia. His body was never recovered. A month later, a small wooden box said to contain the finger bone of a 12th century healer surfaced in a Presbyterian church in New York. The years went by, and the pattern repeated itself. The Whitmore children grew into their roles with varying degrees of devotion to the family enterprise. Thomas, the eldest, became his father's right hand. William, the youngest and most unsettling of the siblings, excelled in preservation, developing methods that produced increasingly convincing relics. The daughters, Mary and Sarah, oversaw the finances and correspondence, maintaining the family's polished image while laundering their blood-stained profits through legitimate trade and property deals. As the colonies edged toward revolution, political chaos opened new doors for the Whitmores. Trade disruptions with England created a shortage of religious artifacts, leaving their workshop one of the few reliable suppliers for churches. The family presented themselves as patriots, but avoided firm allegiances, ensuring their business could survive no matter who controlled their territory. When the Revolutionary War neared its end, a darker chapter of the Whitmore legacy began. In 1781, while the colonies celebrated the promise of independence, the family identified a lucrative new market for their grisly wares. War had left churches damaged and souls hungry for meaning, spurring a surge in demand for religious relics. The Whitmores saw their chance to expand. In February 1782, 10-year-old Joseph Miller vanished from a church-run asylum in Philadelphia. Orphaned by smallpox, Joseph was known for his quiet devotion and gentle leadership among the other children. His disappearance was investigated briefly, then dismissed as another runaway. 3 months later, the Church of St. Michael in eastern Pennsylvania announced miraculous healings surrounding a newly acquired relic, the preserved heart of a supposed child martyr. Prayers before it, parishioners said, brought miraculous recoveries, especially for sick children. Attendance swelled, donations grew, and soon churches across the region sought relics of similar power. William suggested the children, Sarah wrote in a quivering hand in her journal. He said their innocence made them more powerful vessels for divine work. Father hesitated, but the prophet convinced him. God help me. I said nothing. This marked the most monstrous stage of the Whitmore trade. Between 1782 and 1785, at least 16 children, all orphans or from destitute families, vanished within a day's ride of the Whitmore property. Their disappearances were dismissed as wilderness accidents, trafficking, or the cruel hazards of frontier life. Meanwhile, the market for child relics flourished. Churches paid 5 times more for these remains, citing their rare spiritual potency. The Whitmores grew wealthier than ever, investing their gains in land, businesses, and political ties that shielded them from scrutiny. Yet the growing scale of their crimes forced the family to initiate 2 apprentices into their secrets. One of them, Daniel Foster, would later be instrumental in their collapse. In the autumn of 1785, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting of Friends appointed Elijah Thompson, a Quaker minister and former lawyer, to investigate reports of unorthodox religious practices in rural communities. Thompson was meticulous and principled, known for resolving church disputes with both diplomacy and resolve. I was tasked with investigating troubling accounts of relic worship, infiltrating even our plain meetings, he wrote in a journal now locked within the Historical Society's sealed collection. Such idolatry stands against our belief in direct communion with God. Yet several meeting houses had acquired objects said to enhance spiritual experience. His inquiries began in Philadelphia, where he noticed a pattern. Many relics had passed through intermediaries who ultimately traced back to Nathaniel Whitmore. Their origins were elaborate but unverifiable, their stories full of detail but lacking substance. In December 1785, Thompson traveled to Chester County to meet Nathaniel Whitmore face to face. In his journal, he described the encounter. Whitmore received him warmly in his elegant home, offering refreshment and conversation that revealed deep theological knowledge. When Thompson asked about the relics, Whitmore showed him his public workroom, where apprentices crafted immaculate communion vessels and decorative pieces. He spoke at length about European suppliers, producing documents that looked convincing, but bristled with inconsistencies obvious to a trained legal mind. Thompson left uneasy but without proof. He pressed on, interviewing church leaders who had purchased Whitmore relics and cataloging the miracles attributed to them. A sinister pattern emerged. The most dramatic wonders were tied, directly or indirectly, to the Whitmore family and their shadowy circle. I began to suspect a deliberate scheme to manufacture not only the relics themselves, but also the miracles attributed to them, Thompson wrote. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly in different communities, testifying to wondrous events before vanishing and reappearing elsewhere. When their movements were carefully tracked, a pattern emerged, forming a web with the Whitmore property at its center. As Thompson's investigation deepened, strange and unsettling incidents began to follow him. Personal belongings vanished from his lodgings. Letters he sent or expected failed to reach their destinations. Most alarming of all, the evidence he had gathered, notes, witness testimonies, and documentation of inconsistencies, was stolen from his locked trunk while he slept at a roadside inn. In February 1786, Thompson returned to Philadelphia to present his findings before the yearly meeting committee that had authorized his inquiry. The evening before his scheduled testimony, he attended a dinner at the home of a respected Quaker elder. Midway through the meal, he was suddenly overcome by violent illness. Physicians later confirmed poisoning, though the source could not be determined. Though he survived the ordeal, his health was severely compromised for months, forcing a reluctant pause in his work. During this period of enforced convalescence, a new figure emerged, one who would ultimately help expose the true nature of the Whitmore family's enterprise. Daniel Foster, the young apprentice who had been partially initiated into their secrets, began to experience what he described as unbearable attacks of conscience. After witnessing the processing of a child's body, reportedly that of a 12-year-old orphan girl taken from a Methodist children's home, Foster fled the Whitmore compound under the cover of night. With him, he carried a secret journal in which he had meticulously recorded dates, names, and details of the family's activities. After weeks of evasion and hesitation, Foster finally made his way to Philadelphia and approached Elijah Thompson with his testimony. Still frail from the poisoning, Thompson listened in horror to the young man's account. Foster trembled violently as he spoke. He described a cellar chamber beneath the Whitmore workshop, where human bodies were suspended from hooks like butchered livestock, their fluids draining into vessels placed beneath. He spoke of specialized tools designed to remove bone, muscle, and organs with minimal damage, and of preservation methods involving salt, alcohol, and herbs that allowed human tissue to remain lifelike for months or even years. Most disturbing of all was Foster's description of the family's demeanor during these procedures. Calm, methodical, reverent, as if conducting sacred rites rather than desecrating human remains. Nathaniel and Elizabeth Whitmore, he reported, would lead prayers before and after each session, thanking God for choosing these vessels, for his divine purpose, and asking blessings upon those who would receive the relics fashioned from the bodies. Armed with Foster's testimony and the incriminating journal, Thompson prepared to act, but before he could bring the matter to authorities, disaster struck. A sudden fire engulfed his Philadelphia residence, destroying Foster's journal and every piece of evidence it contained. The following day, Foster himself vanished. 3 weeks later, partial remains identified by his distinctive boot buckles were recovered from the Delaware River. Though shaken, Thompson refused to abandon the investigation. He adopted new precautions. No more written records, only carefully guarded oral exchanges with trusted associates. He devised an intricate system of ciphers, informants, and false leads to protect his work, slowly reconstructing his case piece by piece. By the end of 1786, he had connected at least 27 disappearances to the Whitmore operation and identified 9 churches that unknowingly housed human remains disguised as sacred relics. Yet without physical evidence, he could not persuade authorities to act against a family so well connected in Pennsylvania society. The break he needed came from an unexpected source, Sarah Whitmore herself. The winter of 1787 brought heavy snows, isolating the compound for weeks. Tensions within the family deepened. Sarah, who had secretly kept a journal for years, began to crack under the burden of her complicity. Now 32 and unmarried, she had been trapped by her father's refusal to allow suitors who might remove her from the family enterprise. "I can no longer sleep without seeing their faces," she wrote in December 1787. "The children especially haunt me. William has become something inhuman in his enthusiasms. Last week he spoke of preserving entire limbs for sale. Mother encouraged him, quoting scripture about holy vessels. I cannot bear much more of this." Sarah's crisis of conscience coincided with the family's increased ambitions. Their profitable trade in child relics emboldened William, now 27, whose innovations in preservation allowed for more convincing artifacts and higher prices. He urged the family to expand operations, citing the spiritual hunger following the Revolution as an opportunity for profit. Nathaniel, weakened by illness, reluctantly handed leadership to him, despite Thomas's warnings that such expansion invited danger. In January 1788, 2 events set in motion the family's eventual downfall. First, William returned from a journey to western Pennsylvania with 3 new victims, children from a remote settlement devastated by winter sickness. Processing them so rapidly overwhelmed their system, forcing the family to store partially preserved remains in the cellar for longer than usual. Second, Sarah made her decisive move. On a rare solo trip to Philadelphia to deliver correspondence and collect payments, she sought out Elijah Thompson. She had learned of his investigation through her family's surveillance of potential threats. Their clandestine meeting took place in the back room of a Quaker bookshop, and lasted over 3 hours. Thompson ciphered notes deciphered decades later, recorded the encounter. Female W provided confirmation of all suspicions, and worse, beyond imagining. Family operation more extensive than previously documented. Estimates 70+ adult victims, 20+ children since beginning. Detailed processing methods and distribution network. Names of participating church officials. See separate encoded list. Most disturbing. Underground chamber beneath main workshop contains remains in various stages of processing, plus archived samples of all victims. Small preserved portions kept as quality control references labeled with names and dates. Sarah agreed to help Thompson secure tangible proof. She handed him a carefully drawn map of the workshop complex, a blueprint of the horrors beneath the Whitmore estate. She had included in the map the location of the hidden entrance to the underground processing chamber. In a hushed, steady voice, she also revealed the existence of a ledger maintained by Elizabeth Whitmore, an unbroken chronicle of every acquisition and distribution since the trade began, a meticulous record of decades of horror, its very existence capable of destroying the family, if brought to light. "I know I condemn myself by revealing these things," Sarah reportedly told Thompson. "I expect no mercy in this world or the next, but the children's faces give me no peace. I cannot allow more innocence to feed my family's ungodly work." Thompson, recognizing both the immense value and grave danger of what she had shared, arranged for Sarah to remain hidden with trusted Quaker contacts, rather than risk returning to the compound. His decision, intended as a safeguard, instead hastened the inevitable confrontation. When Sarah did not return as expected, William Whitmore immediately suspected betrayal. According to Thomas Whitmore's later confession, the family convened intense counsel. Once her defection became clear, William paced the study with cold fury, his words growing sharper and more violent with each circuit of the room. Their father, frail and sunken in his chair, muttered prayers and scriptural fragments about Judas and betrayal. Elizabeth remained composed, listing methodically every vulnerability Sarah's absence had created, the evidence that now had to be eliminated, and the steps required to protect the family's enterprise. Thomas urged flight, arguing they should abandon the workshop and rebuild elsewhere. But William, whose ambition had already outgrown the compound, refused to surrender what he considered his birthright. The family agreed on a two-pronged plan. William would track Sarah and silence her before she could expose them, while Elizabeth supervised the removal of their most damning materials to a secondary site, an abandoned mine shaft on the western edge of the property that had long been repurposed for hidden storage. Unbeknownst to them, Thompson had already begun to quietly assemble a coalition of allies willing to act. Aware that local officials might count Whitmore supporters among their ranks, he reached out to prominent figures within the Philadelphia yearly meeting. These men, in turn, engaged trusted contacts within the young state government, building a discreet but determined network prepared to bring the Whitmore enterprise down. By mid-February 1788, the plan for a coordinated raid on the Whitmore compound was finalized. But the night before its execution, a heavy snowstorm swept across Chester County, blinding roads and slowing communications. Thompson, fearing any delay would allow the Whitmores to destroy evidence or disappear entirely, made a grim choice. He would proceed with a smaller force rather than risk waiting. He departed Philadelphia with 6 armed men, 2 constables and 4 Quaker volunteers, each fully aware of the monstrous rumors surrounding the family's activities. That night became etched in every surviving account as one of unspeakable revelation. Driving snow slashed across the countryside, the wind howling like a living thing. Thompson's party reached the outskirts of the Whitmore property after nightfall, their lanterns flickering weakly against the darkness and swirling white. Guided by Sarah's map, they approached the workshop from the east, avoiding the main house. "We moved like ghosts through the storm," wrote James Pearson, one of the Quaker volunteers, in a statement later sealed with Thompson's records. The storm cloaked their approach, but it also swallowed sound, leaving them unsure what awaited within. Lantern light glowed faintly through the workshop windows, though it was long past the hour when honest work would cease. The men divided, Thompson and the constables at the main door, the others covering any possible escape routes. After knocking and announcing official business, they waited in a silence that stretched too long. Then the door opened to reveal Thomas Whitmore, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the lantern glow. Pearson recalled his expression, not surprised but composed, as if he had long expected this moment. He stepped aside with quiet finality, inviting them in. The workshop's interior at first appeared innocuous. Tools neatly arranged, devotional carvings half-finished on the benches, the clean scent of wood shavings and varnish in the air. But Thomas's eyes betrayed him. As Thompson questioned him, his gaze kept drifting toward a large cabinet at the far wall. Constable William Bradford crossed the room, opened the cabinet, and found inside not tools, but a black velvet pouch. Within it lay a single preserved human finger. The moment Bradford revealed it, Thomas collapsed to his knees, murmuring what witnesses described as prayers or confessions. When pressed, he admitted his father lay sick in the house, while Elizabeth and William had departed earlier, with several large trunks bound for the western boundary of the property. Thompson immediately dispatched 2 men to intercept them, while the rest compelled Thomas to reveal the entrance Sarah had described. At last, with shaking hands, Thomas led them to a workbench. Slid aside on concealed runners, exposing a heavy trap door set into the floor. The stench that rose from the opening struck them like a blow. A miasma of chemicals and rot, Pearson wrote, the unmistakable stench of human decay. Thomas lit a lantern and descended first, his shadow wavering across the narrow wooden steps. The others followed into a darkness that seemed to consume the light. The underground chamber extended beneath the workshop and far beyond, a warren of rooms carved out of the earth and braced with timber beams. The first room resembled a surgeon's theater more than a workshop. Benches laid out with implements designed for cutting flesh, not wood. Glass containers of various liquids gleamed in the lantern light. A wide drain in the floor fed into dark channels vanishing into the walls. Everything bore the mark of careful organization. Notebooks with precise diagrams lay beside rows of surgical instruments arranged by size and function. One volume lay open, displaying anatomical sketches with detailed preservation instructions. The next chamber revealed the true nature of the family's work. 3 bodies, 2 adults and a child of perhaps 9 or 10, hung from iron hooks embedded in the beams, their limbs positioned for dissection. The remains, partially processed, were treated with preservatives that gave the flesh an unnatural waxy sheen. In the final room, which Thomas spoke of with a hollow, distant voice as the archive, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each lined with small wooden boxes neatly labeled with names, dates, and locations. Random inspection revealed the grim truth. Each contained a preserved fragment, bone, skin, organs, catalogued with clinical precision. At the center of this room sat a heavy wooden table, and upon it lay Elizabeth Whitmore's ledger, exactly as Sarah had described. Its massive pages recorded with merciless clarity every victim acquired, every body processed, and every relic sold to churches along the eastern seaboard. Next to each entry was a price. There was no poetry in its language, only commerce and blood. The church received the fabricated relics along with carefully constructed notes detailing their false provenance. Thomas Whitmore, appearing to have accepted his fate, confessed that since the operation's inception in 1745, they had processed 79 adults and 22 children. The family had supplied their gruesome creations to more than 40 churches across 7 states, laundering their profits through legitimate businesses and land holdings. When questioned about how victims were selected, Thomas gave a chilling reply. Mother had the discernment. She could sense those whose bodies would yield the most powerful relics, the truly devout, the innocents, those whose suffering had purified them for sacred purpose. She taught William to see it too. They would watch at church gatherings and revival meetings, identifying those whose flesh might bring miracles. The search of the underground chambers continued for hours, investigators struggling to document the horrors they uncovered. Near dawn, a disturbance above drew them back to the workshop level. There they found the men who had been dispatched to intercept Elizabeth and William Whitmore. One was gravely wounded, bleeding heavily from a knife wound to his shoulder. William Whitmore fought like one possessed, the man gasped. We found them at the abandoned mine shaft, just as Thomas said, moving boxes from a wagon inside. Elizabeth tried to bargain with us, offering money for silence, while William circled behind. He struck without warning, a butcher's precision to his violence. My companion is dead, his throat cut before I could stop him. Elizabeth and William fled into the forest carrying whatever they could salvage. At daybreak, a broader manhunt began, messengers riding to alert neighboring counties. Nathaniel Whitmore was discovered in the main house, too sick to participate in the escape. He surrendered without resistance, rambling between religious justifications for his family's crimes and confused mutterings. The search for Elizabeth and William stretched for 3 days before reaching its grisly end. Their bodies were discovered in a small hunting cabin 12 miles from the estate, laid side by side upon a crude altar built from local timber. Both had ingested poison after performing some kind of ritual, whose precise nature remains unknown. Notes recovered from the scene suggested they believed their deaths would consecrate the relics they had managed to save during their flight. Thomas Whitmore's trial took place in Philadelphia in April 1788, conducted under unusual secrecy due to the horrific and sensational nature of the case. On May 7, 1788, after giving a complete confession that corroborated the physical evidence found on the estate, he was hanged. Authorities then faced a dilemma unlike any in the nation's short history: how to handle the hundreds of human remains already distributed to unsuspecting churches. After lengthy deliberation involving government and religious leaders, they concluded that preserving public faith and avoiding panic must take precedence over full disclosure. We determined that the faithful should be protected from knowledge that might devastate their spiritual foundations, wrote Judge William Bradford in a sealed memorandum to the Pennsylvania governor. The churches that unknowingly participated in this abomination need not bear the burden of public shame or lose the confidence of their congregations. Therefore, all records of this investigation shall be sealed for a period not less than 100 years, and officials involved are bound to silence by oath. Churches that had purchased Whitmore relics were discreetly informed of their true nature. Each was given a choice: allow the remains to be quietly collected for burial in unmarked graves, or handle the matter themselves with absolute secrecy. Most chose to manage the situation privately, unwilling to involve even discreet officials in the desecration of their sanctuaries. But authorities failed to anticipate a third path. Of the 43 churches named in Elizabeth Whitmore's ledger, historical records later suggested that at least 17 chose to keep the relics, knowingly continuing to present them as holy. Their justifications were deeply unsettling. Several expressed the belief that since the miracles had occurred regardless of the relic's origins, perhaps God had sanctified these poor victims through their unwilling sacrifice, Thompson wrote in his final entry. Others spoke more pragmatically of the donations, prestige, and increased attendance their relics had brought. Surrendering them, they argued, would harm their congregations more than continuing the deception. Horrified by this reasoning, Elijah Thompson dedicated his last efforts to compiling a secret registry of every identifiable victim and the location of their remains, ensuring that the victims would not vanish entirely from history. This document was sealed with the rest of the case, intended for future memorialization when the truth could finally be revealed. The Whitmore property itself was destroyed in a fire officially declared accidental, though many accounts suggest it was deliberately set by local authorities to erase any trace of the atrocities. The land was later sold to families who never learned its history. Sarah Whitmore, whose confession had brought the family's crimes to light, was given a new identity and resettled in Boston under Quaker protection. She lived there until her death in 1823. In her journal, she recorded decades of quiet atonement. "I cannot undo what my family wrought, but each child I helped to safety and education stands against the darkness we created. I have lived 40 years attempting to balance scales that can never be truly balanced. I go to my judgment with no expectation of mercy, only the hope that those we harmed have found the peace we stole from them." The physical evidence, surgical tools, preservation formulas, and the macabre workshop was said to be destroyed after the trial. But rumors lingered for decades that some materials were quietly preserved by medical schools or private collectors, fascinated by the gruesome innovations in tissue preservation William Whitmore had developed. Early 19th century medical texts contain indirect references to methods that closely mirror those described in the Whitmore case, though without attribution. The story might have remained buried forever if not for a courthouse fire in Philadelphia in 1879. During the restoration of water-damaged records, several sealed packets from the 1788 case were mistakenly mixed with regular court files. A clerk discovered portions of Thomas Whitmore's confession and alerted his superiors, who quickly resealed the documents. But rumors spread among courthouse staff, eventually reaching a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer. The subsequent investigation led to a sensationalized newspaper story that, though riddled with inaccuracies, revealed the broad outlines of the Whitmore family's crimes to the public for the first time. The article, published on November 17, 1879, exactly 134 years after Mary Collins became their first victim, created a brief but powerful stir before being publicly condemned by religious leaders as lurid fiction and anti-religious slander. Without access to the sealed case files, the reporter could not substantiate his claims, and under pressure from influential church authorities, the story was officially retracted. By that point, many of the churches that had knowingly kept Whitmore relics had either quietly disposed of them as clergy generations changed, or had absorbed the relics so deeply into their rituals and traditions that their true origins were entirely forgotten, even within the institutions themselves. The physical evidence of the family's crimes had by then been scattered, some buried in unmarked graves, some locked away in private collections, and some still hidden within church reliquaries, their nature known only to a dwindling few. In 1923, while renovating the Pennsylvania Historical Society building, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a bookshelf. Inside lay the complete sealed records of the Whitmore case, apparently concealed there by Elijah Thompson himself, as insurance in case the official files were destroyed. Recognizing their immense historical significance, the Society's director made the controversial choice to preserve the documents while maintaining strict confidentiality. They were cataloged under a deliberately bland title and made accessible only to approved researchers with special permission. Through this carefully limited access, historians gradually reconstructed the full scope of the Whitmore family's operation and the long shadow it cast over American religious practice. The most unsettling revelation to emerge from these later investigations was that human remains processed by the Whitmore family continued to exist in church collections well into the 20th century and possibly still do. A discreet survey conducted in 1967 identified 11 churches across the eastern United States that still possessed objects matching descriptions in the Whitmore ledger. Many of the clergy then in charge had no knowledge of their relics' origins, and their reactions to the revelations varied. Some responded with horrified cooperation, others with outright denial or refusal to investigate further. The Harmony Meeting House, once the Whitmore's place of worship, still stands today. The congregation itself disbanded in the early 1800s, and the modest stone structure was repurposed as a community hall, and later a schoolhouse before being abandoned in the 1930s. Local residents claim to avoid the building after dark, describing an inexplicable sense of unease around the property. Whether this is merely the influence of local legend or something less tangible remains a matter of interpretation. But the most enduring legacy of the Whitmore family may not lie in the scattered physical remains of their victims, but in the psychological reverberations of their deception. The idea that revered devotional objects, believed to channel divine power, were in fact products of serial murder forces, a disturbing confrontation with the limits of faith and the power of human belief. It raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of miracles, the role of perception, and the capacity for self-deception when faith is at stake. The case also highlights that many supposed miracles attributed to these fraudulent relics were witnessed by seemingly honest individuals, with no connection to the Whitmore conspiracy and no apparent motive to lie. Contemporary accounts describe healings, visions, and unexplained phenomena. Were these events mere coincidence and suggestion, or does sincere belief generate its own reality, regardless of the object's true origin? The philosophical implications stretch far beyond the case itself. In 1992, a ground-penetrating radar survey of the former Whitmore property revealed subterranean anomalies consistent with buried chambers and a filled-in mine shaft. Limited archaeological excavation confirmed the presence of structures matching historical descriptions. Though no human remains were recovered, the landowners, disturbed by the findings, refused further digging. The site was resealed and designated as historically significant, though not open to the public. The last verified Whitmore relic surfaced in 2005 during renovations at a small Lutheran church in western Pennsylvania. Behind the altar, workers found a hidden compartment containing a velvet pouch and a letter dated 1788. The pastor, upon learning the object's likely origin, authorized DNA testing, which confirmed it was human tissue. The remains were given a proper burial in the church cemetery, beneath a simple marker reading, "Unknown Child of God, finally at rest." The land that once held the Whitmore family home changed ownership several times after its confiscation and sale. The plot where the workshop had stood remained undeveloped. Crops planted there refused to grow, and livestock avoided grazing on that patch of ground. Local legend claims that on certain autumn nights, especially around November 17th, the faint outline of the workshop appears glowing in the dark. Though no building has stood there for over 2 centuries, this macabre story of faith twisted into profit and murder forces us to examine how history is written and how it is buried. The Whitmore case lingers not only as a record of atrocity, but as a lesson in how uncomfortable truths can be systematically erased to preserve institutional power. For the victims, devout men and women whose bodies were desecrated, and especially the children whose lives were stolen, the greatest injustice was not just their murder, but their erasure. They died twice, once at their killer's hands, and again when their identities were hidden to protect reputations. Somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania, their remains still lie in unmarked graves. Other fragments rest within church reliquaries, still revered by worshippers unaware of their origins. These scattered remains mirror the fragmentation of historical truth itself. Pieces preserved here, portions hidden there, the full story forever incomplete. The next time someone gazes upon a centuries-old relic in a dimly lit church, they may pause to wonder about its true provenance. That moment of doubt, that quiet questioning, honors the victims whose stories were nearly erased. In remembering them, we assert that no institution's reputation outweighs the truth, no matter how terrible that truth may be. The Whitmore case reveals how darkness can hide beneath the veneer of devotion. And it leaves an unsettling question lingering. How many relics still kept in churches today carry secrets that were never meant to be told? Subscribe our channel for more interesting mysteries.